We're sharing about a very special Irish martyr here, Blessed William Terry, an Augustinian. His life is quite different from the rest of the martyrs that we have researched, in that it was a full life of ministry. The Lord just blessed him. It was almost like he was a saint, not a canonized saint, but a proclaimed saint before he even died.
And of course, his whole life has to be a contradiction. He's born actually of an English family, not an Irish family. They were Englishmen who never ever turned against the Pope, against the chair of Peter. They refused to take the oath of supremacy when Henry VIII was alive, and the same with Elizabeth. So they were loyal to the church, faithful from the very beginning. He even had an uncle who was a bishop, the Bishop of Cork. Now, William Terry originally started out taking care. He was chaplain for his cousin and took care of his children, taught them. So he started out very simply.
When he expressed the desire to become a priest, he was immediately sent overseas. We know that he was in Brussels, in Paris, in Valladolid, Spain. And finally, when he came back to the Augustinians here in this area of Cashel, Clonmel, and Fetard, which was his hometown.
Now, there seemed to be a stroke of good luck for William Terry and the priests and the bishops. King Charles I became busily engaged in war, and so he had to take his soldiers off the religious, off the people, and the people were able once again to worship, to have the benefit of the sacraments. And so the priests came out in the open.
Now this was a good thing, but it was also a bad thing, in that for about 4 years they were able to practice their faith almost freely. I mean, if there was such a word in Ireland during that time, this would have been the time when it was possible. But the bad thing was that once Cromwell had defeated Charles I and executed him, the bishops and the priests were so visible, it was so obvious who they were an easy mark to find. And yet with all of that, and with Cromwell coming down so hard on the religious of Ireland, William Terry was still able to practice his ministry, while not in the open, almost completely freely.
Well, he practiced from his home. But you know, like the curé of Ars, like all holy men, he could not be kept hidden under a bushel basket. So people came from far and wide to him. He was the perfect confessor. He was their spiritual guide, their spiritual director. He was the one who brought them the Eucharist, the nourishment that they needed, the courage and the strength to go on.
His house imprisonment reminds us a lot of St. Paul.
That's true.
I mean, his life resembled that of St. Paul. While he was imprisoned by his enemies, he ministered beautifully to the people.
Oh yeah, they came. He never stopped. Well, you know, as Jesus was betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, so William Terry and the people of this area were also betrayed. And the next thing you know, on Holy Saturday, as he was vested up to begin the sacrifice of the Mass, that ongoing sacrifice of the cross, he was to start his way of the cross. Soldiers broke into the house where he was celebrating Mass and took him prisoner.
He was already vested up, so if there was any question, are you a priest? He was a priest. He was vested up for Mass. He couldn't deny the fact that he was a priest. Also in the house, they had found some literature material that was anti-Protestant and in favor of releasing Catholics from prisons. So now this is where it really gets exciting. It's unbelievable, the life of this man. Normally, the tradition was that when the British would catch one of these priests, they would sentence him, they would judge him, sentence him the same day, and the very next day he would be executed. Father William Terry stayed 4 weeks in this prison. He was not the only priest, there were 3 priests. Father Terry ministered not only to his brother priests, but to the guards, to the prisoners. I mean, they gave him such a great treatment, it was like he wasn't a prisoner at all. Nobody can understand why he was given such beautiful treatment.
Even his biographers were amazed as to the treatment that he received. Was he truly in persona Christi capitas? Was he in reality that sign of Jesus in their presence, as every priest is? Did he emanate that light which comes from our holy priest? Because for all the weeks that he was there, the other priests were consoled by him. They received the Eucharist. So he celebrated Mass every day, clandestinely, but every day.
Father Terry's trial was a very sad situation. I don't know if he was naive or he really believed that he could get justice at the hands of the British. Remember, his family was English. So he pleaded his case with all his heart. He poured his heart out, proclaiming he was not a political person. He was a priest. He was a religious. All he cared about was spiritual things. And he really believed that when the jury went in to deliberate, that he would get a fair sentence. But he didn't know that the head of the jury asked the captain of the guards on his way in, should he declare him guilty, and he was told yes. And so within a very short period of time, they came out and they said, yes, you're guilty.
And did he not have reason to believe that he might possibly be released because of the 5 priests that were imprisoned? He was the only one executed. And yet, he had pleaded with them. He had, by all that is right, they should never have executed him. On the day that he went to the gallows, he was vested fully as an Augustinian.
Now, they never let anybody do that. But they allowed him to vest up as an Augustinian, as if he were to go to celebrate Mass, as he walked the way to the gallows.
When Father Terry arrived at the gallows, he knelt and prayed like his Lord before him. And there was a prisoner, an older man, who was preceding him. And he continued to pray for him, just as Jesus had prayed for the good thief.
Now, as he started up the steps to the gallows, on each step he did a teaching on one of the commandments and then one of the sacraments. So as he would walk up each step, he'd do a teaching on a different part of the church. He taught about the Eucharist brilliantly. He taught about the Pope brilliantly. The people were awestruck with his teachings. There was a Protestant minister in the group who started arguing with him. But he was no match for the infused knowledge and the wisdom of Blessed William Terry. And before you know it, the people were all siding in with Father Terry and against the Protestant minister. So the minister said, please, to the guard, please get this execution moving. But the guard would not stop Father Terry, and so he continued to teach. When he finished, he blessed his executioners. He forgave everybody for what was about to happen. He gave the signal to the executioner, who finally, after Blessed William Terry gave him the signal, he pulled the noose and Father Terry was hung. Now, as the noose tightened around his neck, blood started pouring out of his nose. The people ran up to the gallows to try to catch some of the blood in their handkerchiefs because they knew they had the relics of saints. Other people started tearing his clothes off so they could use them as a relic.
One of the priests with him, a canon regular, who escaped execution, took a relic of his clothes, and a few days later he was on the sea on his way to Belgium when a violent storm broke out and the ship was about to capsize, when he took the relic and asked for the intercession of William Terry. The sea immediately calmed. The sea immediately calmed. And they knew, just as Mary Magdalene and the apostles and our Blessed Mother knew that her son had risen from the dead, they knew that they had a saint in heaven, that his brother had gone home to be with Jesus.
The details of the life of Blessed Maurice McIntyre are somewhat sketchy. We first hear about him when the Earl of Desmond was trying to have a crusade, a revolution against the forces of England. It was an ill-fated campaign, and he was losing, and he was trying to hide himself somewhere around Clonmel. He just wanted to get away from everybody. Father McIntyre wound up running away with him, trying to escape from the British. But the Earl of Desmond was more astute at trying to hide than McIntyre was, and so in September of 1583 he was caught and he was imprisoned here in Clonmel. The Earl of Desmond was caught 2 months later and was killed. Strangely enough, Father McIntyre was not killed.
And that was unusual because what they would usually do was that upon capturing a priest, a bishop, a religious, they would immediately kill them. They would torture them and then kill them. I wonder if it wasn't because Tipperary is a small little town.
Well, it's a small community, and it was smaller even then. Remember, he was a local boy. And, you know, maybe these people were a little tired of the killing that was going on to their own people. I mean, they wound up killing their own people. It didn't make sense. Maybe they're getting a little tired of it. At any rate, the jailers allowed him to live. Somehow his record got lost, and they didn't know that he was here. And for 2 years, he was able to minister from within the jail fairly freely in the town.
You know, Bob talks about the people of this village. And sure, they were frightened. Sure, they were just terrified of what was going on. All the senseless torture and murdering of innocent people whose only crime was that they were Catholic. But in their hearts, they were Catholic. In their hearts, they loved Mother Church. And so although their heads were telling them, don't get involved, you're going to be killed, your family's going to be killed, your house is going to be burned, in their hearts, they loved their priests, and they tried to help him.
Now, the downfall of Father McIntyre came on one Easter Sunday. One of the local merchants wanted to have Easter Mass celebrated in his home. And this was a great gift when you consider they weren't allowed to celebrate Mass anywhere ever except out in the fields. And so he bribed the jailer. He gave him money to have Father McIntyre come to his home to celebrate Mass. But what happened was that the soldiers were coming through the town at about that time, and the jailer panicked, thought that he might get caught having let the priest out of jail, so he told the captain that the priest had escaped and that he was going to be celebrating Mass at this merchant's house. Well, they all came, and just as the priest was getting ready to celebrate Mass, the soldiers broke in, saw him in his vestments, they arrested him. He was able to hide at first. And they said to the merchant, the owner of the house, that he was going to be killed and that his house was going to be burned if they didn't find the priest. So he immediately came out of hiding, surrendered himself.
Like Maximilian Kolbe.
Now,
didn't he?
Even with all of that, they said to him, if you'll take the oath of supremacy, nothing will happen. You can go about your business and live your life fully. Even with all of that, having been there for 2 years, he couldn't do it. And because he couldn't do it, and because they had to do something, they had to execute it.
You know, they had to make an example of him. They wanted to use him. Every time they caught a priest or a bishop, they wanted to use them. Just say that she is the real head of the church. You don't even have to mean it.
You don't have to believe it.
Just take that oath. But how that would have demoralized the people. The faith of Ireland has been fed on that loyalty. that shedding of blood rather than deny the faith.
And so, on April 20th, 1585, one of the 17 beatified martyrs of Ireland, Blessed Maurice McInerney, was hung. But he was never forgotten. And even till this day, 400 years later, his spirit still lives with the Irish people and now with the people of the world.
I remember when it was said about Jesus, if he is not of God, he will soon be forgotten. But if he is of God, there is nothing you can do. The same thing with these men. I'm sure the English thought with each one, well, that's it. One less to worry about. But they were never forgotten. You don't know the name of the man
Who killed him.
who killed him, the executioner, do you? But you will remember.
They said, well, there's one less Irishman, but it was not one less Irishman. It was one more martyr for the church.
And our church has grown on the foundation that was nourished by the blood of these martyrs. Can you do less? I hope that this martyr has put a stamp on your heart. And when you see someone coming against your church, you will remember that he chose death rather than deny his church.
We have paid a high price for our church. Don't let anybody take it away from you.
We begin in the year 1612. Now, the English were determined to crush any political resistance in the country. And they thought they were getting a pretty good foothold in Ireland, but they knew there was one thing they had to do to be completely successful. They had to take away all hope. That is, crush religion. And so they went after prelates and bishops and priests and religious. But they wanted to be very careful because they didn't really want a tremendous uprising of the people. So they said it was treason. It was not for religious reasons, but instead for political. Now, you see, what has been happening is that they are developing martyrs, which they didn't want. Every time they killed a priest or a bishop or a prelate, they made a martyr, and that made the Irish stronger. Instead of frightening them, they strengthened them. Well, they had to do something, so they decided to pass a law. And this was during the reign of Charles I, 1625 now, through 1649. And they passed a law, an oath of allegiance, which was more stringent than Elizabeth's oath of supremacy. Under this law, it became martial law, and they could try someone for treason just for being Catholic. And the way they wrote the law was so misleading that the Irish Parliament, which was predominantly Catholic, passed it. Now, isn't that what's happening today? Isn't this Cairo conference that we're living through today, where the word our Pope says is so deviously phrased, it is nothing different than what they had proposed in the first place. Only now, the enemy is just clouding the issue so that people will think that it doesn't include abortion, but it does.
So now the same situation applied in Ireland. They rewrote the law so that it was the same thing. It was more strict, more stringent than the oath of supremacy, and yet the Irish people in the Parliament did not realize that what they were passing was something worse than what they had had. What the British were trying to do to keep it away from the religious aspect was to accuse these priests of being in league with the revolutionaries. Well, most of them were not, but you have to understand that the revolutionaries were fighting to maintain the church, the Roman Catholic Church, as the head of state the head of the church here in Ireland, and the British were maintaining that the throne, the Queen or the King of England, was in charge of the church. And the only way they could do this was to make it an act of treason.
Well, actually, what the Irish were trying to do was to remain faithful to the seat, to the papacy in Rome. And that was in opposition to what the English wanted. They wanted the allegiance to be to the king or to the queen.
Now, of the two, there were only 2 living bishops left in Ireland. One of them was in prison in Dublin Castle. His name was Conor O'Devaney. Conor O'Devaney had nothing to do with anything political. He was spiritual. He was a bishop. He was a pastor of his flock. Conor O'Devaney had been born of the people. He became a Franciscan observant and was ordained bishop in Rome in 1582. And then he came back to practice in his diocese, which was to be down in Connacht, which is today in Northern Ireland. But he never really got back to that diocese at all. He was arrested and he was put in prison. He was one of the first that decided to use this new oath against. And so they accused him of treason based on this new stringent oath that had been passed. He was given the opportunity to take the oath, and he refused. So they put him in Dublin Castle. During the uprising, during the fighting in his area, he was protected to a degree by the chieftains, by the people that were in charge of all the fighting. But as soon as they were defeated and left the area, he became completely vulnerable. He had no one to protect him. And so pretty much immediately he was captured and put in Dublin Castle. He was given the opportunity to take the oath to the throne, in which case he would have been released. He could have become a Protestant minister, anything he wanted. Naturally, he refused to take the oath.
Now, with Father Patrick O'Loughlin, it was quite a different story. He came from a family that would have made him automatically under suspicion. He was from a different section of Ireland, Donaghmore, in County Tyrone. In his family, there had been so many priests that they were considered chaplains of the O'Neill clan. Now, the O'Neill clan, as you know, was the moving force in Ireland at that time, and they were the ones that were fighting the British. Now, Father Patrick O'Loughlin did not take part in the battle. He was merely chaplain. We would say spiritual director to O'Neill. When O'Neill went into exile at the end of a very severe defeat, Father O'Loughlin, as his spiritual director, went with him.
Now, it was determined that these 2 priests, Father O'Loughlin and Bishop O'Devaney, would be perfect guinea pigs to try and execute based on this new oath of allegiance. But even with that, they had to set up a kangaroo court because there was no way that they would be able to really convince anybody of it.
You know what? Just think about it. He'd left with O'Neill, went to Europe. They think that he probably went to Rome. There he was accepted. Why did he come back to Ireland? Did he come back so that he would give strength to his fellow Irishmen? Because when he was asked to take that oath of allegiance, he would have been a perfect tool, a perfect sword to stab the hearts and souls of the Irish. He couldn't take it because he was true to his Lord, his church, and to the flock that he shepherded, his people.
Now, they were not able to try them in their local areas because the people would never have convicted them, so they rushed the charges up to Dublin. All the charges were made in Dublin, and they built up this tremendous case against them in Dublin, but it was a case not based on religion, but based on treason. Oath of allegiance. Bishop O'Devaney immediately twisted around and claimed that he was being accused and he was being tried for no other reason than that he was a Catholic priest. And this was exactly what the British did not want him to do. Anyone with an ounce of intelligence could see that that's what he was being tried for, but it didn't mean anything because they had already predetermined that they were going to be guilty, and so they were found guilty.
But a wonderful thing happened. Those who had taken the oath of allegiance rejected it and became Catholics again. This sign, this powerful sign of this priest and this bishop.
Now this took place actually while they were going to the gallows. As our two priests were being taken to the gallows, a crowd of 1,000 people began to follow, and this made the British very nervous. They weren't sure if they could control the crowds, and this is when these conversions were taking place among those who had already taken the oaths of loyalty. They begged the prisoners to take the oath of allegiance. The whole thing was becoming completely out of hand because now they were going to have to kill all these people. So they begged the two prisoners, please take the oath of allegiance. You don't have to mean it. Just take it. You can deny it in 6 months from now, but for now, just take it. They couldn't do that, and they refused. The program you have just seen is